Hello everyone. Now, here we are. The raid is complete. Baltimore County Cork has been sacked. If you missed it, go back and listen to the earlier episodes in our series. Oh, and also, by the way, I was inspired to do this series by reading Des Eakin's book called The Stolen Village. Would definitely recommend. Listened? Ready? Well then, let's dive back into, or should I say, onto, the man o' war ship captained by Murat Reis, formerly known as Jan Jan Dune, as dawn is breaking on the 20th of June 1631. Let's for a moment stand on the shoreline as we watch massive foreign warships slowly disappear over the horizon. For those on board, only 2 will ever see Baltimore again. The smoke is still rising from the cottages, but the screams have finally stopped. 107 people have been taken from their beds and loaded onto a Dutch-built man-o'-war, commandeered by a general from the Republic of Salé and bound for Algiers. But below decks, these meet captives taken by the corsairs en route. Portuguese sailors, Polynesians, which is the fancy name for those from Galicia or Andalusia in northern Spain, along with a few more Frenchmen. There's also a number from the vessels of the 2 men who played a massive part previously in our story, but, spoiler alert again, one will meet a very sticky end indeed. Those 2 men were Edward Follett from Dartmouth and the sticky end man, John Hackett from Dungarvan, who led 2 boats. And that 107 is not counting Timothy Curlew and John Davies, who had both been killed in the battle. However, between 3 and 4 p.m, before the pirates lift anchor and leave the remains of Baltimore, a curious thing happens. The pirates release captives, and they leave them on the shore. In case you were wondering, this most definitely was not purely, or probably not even partly, out of the goodness of their hearts. Those that are left are an elderly man known as Old Osborne and his maid, a woman named Alice Hurd. Also, a few of the sailors, including the captains of the Dartmouth boats, Follett and Carew, and that Dungarvan man, John Hackett. But why? Hackett literally led them. Why leave the one man who knows exactly what just happened right there for the authorities to catch? The answer? Maths, or math if you're American. Essentially, cargo space versus market value. Every single person in the hold takes up space, time and provisions. The pirates from North Africa considered their human captives as inventory. Osborne and his maid, for example. Old Osborne was, obviously enough, old, and for all we know, his maid may either be of such an age or in such a physical state as to be almost worthless in the Algiers slave markets. Food, fresh water and space for the 2-month voyage are far too precious. And the captains, Carew, Follett and Hackett? It could be a case of maritime courtesy and respect for fellow captains. However, that is highly unlikely. More likely, it was probably figured that holding them until a ransom was paid, especially since their ships were deserted, was just more hassle than it was worth. Also, they had served their purpose. We'll talk about it in the next episode. Now, Murat and his men weren't totally unpursued. It was very, very delayed, but the 5th Lion's Whelp, which I accidentally called the 6th Lion's Whelp in a previous episode, eventually gets permission to give chase, under the command of a Captain Hook. Again, that's a next episode issue. But let's look at life aboard the pirate ship. You've been beaten and dragged from your bed, only to be shoved below deck on a ship and plunged into complete darkness. Unfortunately, we don't have many records from the Baltimore captives, so much of this is coming from Olafur Egilson, the Icelandic pastor captured in 1627 by the same boat. The details would be extremely similar. The men are thrown into a dark hold, bound in chains which make it near impossible to move, and subject to frequent and harsh beatings. The smell, bilge water and body odour, disgusting. And because of your chains, you can't even escape if you wanted to. All to a course of wails from 157 souls who have lost their lives as they knew them in a few short hours. The chains are eventually removed, but only once there hasn't been land in sight for ages. However, Eggleston's diary reveals that the captors weren't complete monsters. He notes that a number of women died from old age, frailty, or exposure, and these weren't just tossed carelessly. No, these were wrapped in cloth, and prayers were said before they were reverently committed to a watery grave. Pregnant women were also given a remarkable level of respect. As an example, an Icelandic woman named Margaret goes into labour in these dark, nightmarish conditions. The pirates could treat her with indifference, but instead, they give her her own private quarters in the hold, and once the baby is born, give Margaret old shirts as makeshift swaddling clothes. Also, something that strikes the North Europeans as strange, these Islamic pirates wash many times a day. Their faces, their hands and arms, and their feet every time before they pray. Now, Puritans often view excessive bathing with suspicion, and Europe wasn't the most hygienic place in the world in the 1630s. So, the Baltimore captives must have found this shocking in every sense of the word. This, combined with prayers and languages of the Corsairs, is intensely confusing for the Baltimore captives. This state of terror and profound confusion lasts for weeks as the ship sails south through the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. Remember, there's a language barrier, so even if they wanted to, the captives couldn't tell their captives where they were heading. Anyway, eventually they get to Algiers. The journey has ended, but the nightmare is just beginning. Imagine being a captive, stuck in a dark hold for days, and then suddenly brought up, blinking against the glaring sunlight. A type you've never seen before. Then they're sorted, like fruits and vegetables. In the captive's case, separated by sex and age. The men were ranked by physical strength, muscle mass, and perceived stamina. The strongest men faced the grimmest prospect, chained to the oars of boats as galley slaves. Chained by the ankle to a wooden bench, you're not allowed to move until the journey is over. Toilet breaks? Heck no. Go where you sit. Talking? Certainly not. You're a slave. You sure as heck can't be given the chance to plan a revolt. Driven by a rhythmic drumbeat, you sleep minimally at the oar, eat and drink at the oar. Diseases due to crowded conditions are rampant, as are beatings from your overseers. And it's not like there's a retirement age. You row until your heart gives out or you die of exhaustion. In short, it is a lifelong death sentence. And the Baltimore women, you may ask. Different, but no less traumatic. For the Baltimore women, the real ordeal started on the 10th of August, 1631. And the reason we have this info is all down to the English consul to Algiers at the time, James Frizzell. Anyway, you step off the boat and are greeted by essentially the entire city of Algiers as you are paraded to the Dey's palace through the narrow, winding streets. The crowds are there in morbid curiosity to stare at these northern Europeans. Sensory overload from the sights, sounds and smells of North Africa is absolute and terrifying. Those twisting streets are intentional to confuse any raiders, but they inadvertently also stop any potential escapes from captives. Anyway, they are marched through these streets to a place called the Bagno, and the crowds are massive. Algiers in 1631 is a massively multicultural city with well over 100,000 people. Compare that to the village of Baltimore with barely over 100 people, or even combining it with the town further inland, you're still barely hit the 1,000 mark, or not even. Again, a reminder that the spices, herbs, and other sights and smells the Baltimore captives are experiencing is like nothing they could have ever imagined to be real. Once the men, women, and children reach the market, they are placed in circles. Prospective buyers walk around them, free to touch however and wherever they please. For example, hands are examined for calluses, as a sign of hard workers. Teeth and faces are examined, and other regions, shall we say, to judge health. Now, interestingly, our source for this is not the Anglican Mr. Eggleston, but instead a Catholic French Trinitarian priest called Father Pierre Dan. He recalls husbands and wives being callously separated on the auction block, mothers screaming as their daughters are taken. They know they will never see each other this side of eternity. Now, you might be wondering what a Catholic priest is doing in Algiers, and this brings an interesting point. The Trinitarians, and an order called the Mercedarians, were allowed to operate openly in Muslim Algiers. But of course, there was a monetary reason. These priests' jobs were simple. Document Christian slaves, then go to Europe to raise funds and awareness so they could be bought back at the auction. Anything to get more money. However, this fund never reached the people of Baltimore. And now we get to the most scandalous part of the whole affair. Honestly, you thought this series was bad already. Just wait. After the auction, the slaves are taken to their new lives and living conditions. These varied massively depending on whether the slaves were publicly state-owned or privately citizen-owned. The public slaves are mostly those galley slaves we mentioned earlier. However, the private slaves had a much more varied and complicated destiny. It really depends on who your master was, and there are records of some masters even treating their slaves like family members, albeit ones with no freedom and completely beholden to their master's bidding. Some were even given, and I quote, warm bread straight from the oven, and good filling porridge mixed with fat. This would have been a massive upgrade to what they were eating on the ship, and honestly, even what they would have been eating in Baltimore. It created a dynamic where some may have preferred their lives in Algiers over a prospective return to Baltimore. More to that in a bit. And this leads to what was called assimilation. By 1634, Frizzell, the English consul, reported that 40 of the Baltimore captives are either dead or had turned Turk. Now, turned Turk was a term used to essentially say that the Baltimore Puritans had decided to convert to Islam, which in many cases meant an easier life. It's thought that most of that 40 had probably not died but had turned Turk. That still leaves many Baltimore survivors who lived out the entirety of the rest of their lives in North Africa. Strange as it might seem, the Baltimore captives likely, in the main, didn't even want to go back. They are, in many cases, getting better food, the sunlight was available way more often, and it's not like they would have felt loved in either England or Baltimore. There is also an idea that they may have been suffering from what has become known as Stockholm Syndrome. If you don't know, essentially that's where captives bond with their captors, sometimes literally falling in love. The brain's way of protecting itself from the horrors of reality. By 1645, a child taken from Baltimore at 4 or 5 in 1631 has no memory of the land of their birth. No matter how hard they try, they would always consider themselves a product of the land in which they grew up, in this case, Algiers. And for the women, particularly, there would be shame. They would be viewed, if they returned to Ireland or England, as the wife of a Muslim. Also, those women likely had children with these Muslim men, so how on earth would they be expected to go back to rainy, dreary Southern Ireland, where they'd be viewed as liberal pariahs? Also, there is a chance, albeit slim, for social mobility from slavery to greatness in 17th century Algiers, particularly since Ireland at this time had entered a cycle of mini famines, culminating in what is known as the Great Hunger, which, by the way, I've covered in the very first episode of this podcast. Go listen to it. Complete and utter side note here, but Baltimore's population only began recovering around the 1830s, and then the famine came, and it all had to start again. Now, you may be wondering what happened back in the British Isles. Well, in short, it took 14 years for anyone to care. Then, in 1845, they bring a huge amount of money, probably trying to make up for lost public opinion, and bring home 240 British prisoners from Algiers. Guess how many of those were from the Baltimore crew? Go on, guess. 2. Yep, 2. A man named Alan Hawkins and a woman called Joan Broadbrook. However, there are reports from 1633 of a woman ransomed in Livorno, Italy, who allegedly gave her origin as Baltimore, County Cork, Ireland, but there's no concrete evidence of this, and nobody has any clue who she really is. Now, I really wanted to get this episode done this week, however, there's a lot of details left to cover, so I'm going to put them in a separate episode. I will release these, if you're lucky, maybe this week, but I might not get time for that, so it's likely going to be in the next few weeks. Thanks for listening. Like this if you can, tell me what you did and didn't like, follow me on Instagram at LeanBlakePodcaster, and, most importantly, tell everyone about the History and Heritage Podcast. Bye!